can live up to it. Anyway, thank you very much. And I'd like to thank the conveners for giving me this opportunity to talk about the role of food packaging in the changing relationship between grocers and shoppers, which I'm just, it is a huge sweep of a time period, but it's mainly across the 18th to 20th centuries, parochially, primarily in the UK, and in very broad terms with parallels across Europe, the US, and also similarities are found in what were British colonies and dominions. Now, in this slide from the 1930s, I hope you can see the title. I've got things from Zoom in its way and I can't see it, but it should tell you that it's the 1930s. And two people are shown in this photograph. I suspect everyone joining this seminar recognizes where those two are and the activity being portrayed. They're in a shop, readily identifiable as a grocer's. The man wears a light-coloured coat. I seem to remember they were sort of fawn or beige colour, which informed onlookers will recognise, as I do, is one typically worn by English grocers before and since this photograph was taken. The woman is in outdoor clothes, what at the period in the UK would have been known as a costume, that is a matching skirt and jacket. And she's wearing gloves, a hat, and a fur around her shoulders. And if it's anything like the one my mother had, the mouth of the fob, as it possibly was, would open and then clip onto its foot. It was somewhat macabre if you think about it. And she has a basket on her arm. The man is leaning forward as he displays a tin of some foodstuff. I couldn't see what it was, but it clearly shows that very distinctive keystone shape of a Heinz brand. Both are smiling. She's looking down at the tin, and he's looking directly at her, as if he's anticipating a favourable response. And note, he's got a pencil behind his ear. And as an oral history of 2004 noted, there were no calculating cash tills. It was the shop assistant's job to total up your purchases and your job to check that they've got it right. But the grocer needed a pencil to whip out and write down what. Behind the shopkeeper are shelves and shelves of goods for sale, all packaged. If you look very closely, you can see that the items are piled up as a child might make with their wooden blocks, crenellated like a castle or high as a church steeple. Sorry. There's modern strip lighting, which is bright, and cleanliness is implied by the tiling on the wall behind the packages. You can see it shining there. And the whole image supports the idea that he knows about the stock behind it. That's his domain. And so is in a position to advise her, who carefully surveys what he offers. A main feature of the photo that could very easily be overlooked because it's so familiar is the counter, either side of which they're standing. It marks off areas of the shop. He is entitled to go behind the counter, crucially with access to the goods on sale, where she may not, reliant on him to reach items down or to pass them across for her. He not only knows where to find whatever she's asking for, but also knows his stock, knows about the different brands and their prices, and can help her make comparisons between them. He also knows about her, for she is likely to be a regular customer, and amongst other things, he has an idea about what she can afford. Now, the next three images, there's one, there's the next, and there's the third. I'll go back if I possibly can manage it. There's the first of the three. They're all similar, all include a counter marking off area only for staff behind it and for both grocer and customer in front of it. The first of the three might be described as a greengrocer, although there's a counter above a chiller cabinet in the background, which suggests meat and poultry or perhaps fish. The next two are from the US. one rather earlier, the late 1800s, and the next about the same time. You can tell from the women's clothes roughly when they were. And the point about these two is not only there's a counter in both, but one also has weighing scales. Which one is it? No, it's the previous one. Oh, I'm out of practice. There we are. There are the weighing scales. You see, that's that curiously shaped. I forgot what the container is called for the goods that have been put in front of it to be weighed, and that's quite important, as we'll see. And both counters are prominently marking out the space. Those images provide glimpses of the relationship between grocer and customer, and maybe they were idealized for the camera. But that relationship is today's topic. Focus on mid to late 18th century to mid-late 20th century, identifying the role of food packaging in key changes. And I'm drawing on my book, which, as was mentioned at the outset, it's got that slightly irritating title, but my editor liked it, The Not So Secret Lives of Food Packaging. And it was published in January this year. I should say a couple of things about the book. It's very firmly the first, not the last word on the history of food packaging. And I should say that today's discussion of the place of food packaging in the grocer-customer relationship is also preliminary. In developing today's topic, I'm heavily indebted to and inspired by John Stobbart, especially his magisterial study of grocers and groceries in provincial England. It's a really wonderful study. And, it's readable just like a novel. So good. I'll show you the cover of the book, not only because I think the book is very good, but also that the cover is very elegant and nicely designed. Now, let me pause for a moment to say something about what or whom is the grocer I'm talking about. And here I'm risking mangling the history and so saying. But a grocer in medieval and early modern periods was a particular type of retailer, or perhaps more accurately, a wholesaler, for a grocer bought goods in bulk. In English, the word grocer, excuse me, derives from the French word grosser. There we are. And I'm sorry, I've forgotten the other apostrophe, closing the parenthesis. Having bought in bulk, grocers divided their goods into smaller quantities for retail sale. Now, one of Stobbart's observations helped highlight the position of the grocer, at least in 18th century England. The whole system of retailing had, as he puts it, become very dynamic and sophisticated, with by then a very wide choice of goods, especially in the towns and cities. But even a village shop had quite a considerable range. But on the one hand, that increase can be hailed as a good thing. It also required more attention from shoppers to work out quite what to buy. But as John Stobbart notes, more novelty and choice, and I'm quoting, could create problems for shoppers, as it made it more difficult for them to judge the quality of wares and make informed choices between different goods. And he cites Blondet and Van Damme, observing that a close relationship with a trusted shopkeeper was invaluable, since it helped customers negotiate the options available. This did not mean that 18th century shoppers were passive, blindly following shopkeepers' advice, and that this applies into the 19th century. But on the contrary, customers also became knowledgeable and discerning, and could in any case pass the time simply busy doing what nowadays would be called browsing without buying anything, too much of which would make them unpopular with shopkeepers. This comparatively new relationship, sorry, I'm forgetting to move the slides on. Told you I was out of practice. This comparatively new relationship between customer and shopkeeper is set against a history of buying and selling, in which key features of purchasing foodstuffs were already established. Display is central. Being able to see whatever was on sale was essential and de facto established centuries earlier. Selling outdoors was significant when interiors were typically so dark. Good light made it harder to hide poor quality or even spoiled goods. And although a place where wares were displayed, market stalls were and are typically not fixed, but assembled trestle table style just for the day. But slowly a shop came to mean somewhere fixed with goods sold through the window, and eventually, typically, a room within a house, which was open fronted, no glazing, and it had a shutter or grill put up overnight for security, of course. Selling indoors means better protection from the weather, and retail sale more generally, not just in grocers, and perhaps particularly less so in food shops, to the extent there were any. 15th century records refer to fittings, and particularly to something that was known then as a showing board, to be used to display wares. At the same time, as I said, there were not so much grocers as retailers more generally, because most food was bought at market stalls out in the open air once a week, perhaps twice a week, until well into the 20th century. And even now, there are markets with foods, across London and across the whole of England. So food was bought outdoors from market stalls, also from street hawkers in large cities. And of course, there's Charlie Tanner's lovely work on that. Though medieval markets continued through the early modern period, mainstay for selling provisions to townspeople and to country people who came into town to buy and sell. At the same time, and this is still thinking about display, although glass itself was still costly and putting in glazed windows expensive, thus confined to the urban elite shops of the 18th century, it meant, though, that such a physical feature of shops in general was thereby established. People came to find that even if they were rare and for elite shops where they lived in the country or a small town, nonetheless they knew of the new glass windows. So too were shop fixtures and fittings such as shelves and nests of drawers, and of course the counter. These became familiar into the 18th century and onwards. And a second feature was the eventual advent of fixed prices. An element of haggling can be assumed in those medieval markets, and if you're so minded, can be successfully managed at stalls in London street markets today, especially if you're shopping later in the afternoon and it has started to rain and everybody go home. By the 19th century, prices were beginning to be marked on goods and the idea of brands became established. Shops in metropolitan centres became larger, eventually with artificial lighting, and fixed prices became more prevalent. Styles of selling in general were changing. One customer sufficiently energetic to generate complaints about pushy sales methods. On the other hand, the idea of having a look round was starting to take hold among far broader cross sections of the public, with browsing as an enjoyable leisure activity. Nonetheless, the whole venture was ultimately about selling. Shopper and shopkeeper brought face to face, supply and demand intersecting. All this provides for grocers to take their place as knowledgeable tradespersons, serving, and I stress the verb, customers who need to buy their goods. Service was in person. The form of social relationship between shopkeeper and customer was in part expressed by the manner in which they greeted customers and then escorted them to a chair where the customer remained while shopkeepers or their assistants brought goods to them for their inspection. In principle, the customer was thus temporarily pinned down, unable to wander about or scrutinize wares more closely. And in this picture, you can see there's a pair of bent wood chairs. They seem always to be bent wood chairs on the customer's side of the counter, available for them to sit down while wares were brought for them to look at and inspect. But customers were not, of course, wholly powerless. They could decline to buy, get up from the chair and leave the shop. And in the process, of course, they irritate the shopkeeper. A complaint that John Stobbart quotes from Daniel Defoe's Complete English Tradesman, records that shopkeepers would complain that the customers tumble over my goods and deafen me with a round of questions. Incidentally, just reading the contents page of Defoe's book makes clear quite how much work was considered necessary for successful shopkeeping. Most important is to emphasize that a key quality of the relationship revolved around that personal service. Packaging, food packaging in the 18th century grocery trade was established. A good deal was paper for retail sale, but sacks could be used for storing rice, barrels for butter, and a bag for biscuits. But the bag was prominent. As Stobbart says, bags in which a wide variety of goods might be stored, and the smaller paper packets in which they were often sold. They also appear in witness testimony in trials for shoplifting, in such a way as to suggest they were the norm. Thus, we see separate thefts of a bag containing 17 pounds of tea. Sorry, I was distracted. Somebody was talking, I don't know. Another with 14 pounds of ginger and a sack with 56 pounds of rice, along with a paper of nutmeg and parcel of almonds. It's quite a degree of shoplifting, that. Containers that increase the recognizability of the foodstuffs inside are forwarding by, for instance, the packaging of tea in tin canisters turned up in the 18th century. But it seems that by the early 19th century, packaging increasingly took the form of bags. And John Stobbart reports that around 1816, one shop held various grades of paper, including blue paper, generally used for wrapping sugar, but also 109 pounds of paper bags sold in seven separate lots. Grocers were still selling £2 weight, approximately a kilo of sugar in distinctive blue paper bags in 1950s London, I should note. And I haven't yet got to the bottom of why blue paper was particularly used for sugar. It was quite a heavy paper, and I still have to continue to pin that one down. And the point is that the grocers were doing the packaging. They were packaging, either measuring out an amount of sugar or weighing it out there and then on the counter while continuing to talk to the client, or some pre-packaging could be done in the back room in some grocers if there was enough space. So this wrapping foodstuffs, what's the word? Bespoke wrapping was central to the element of the grocer's work. It was integral to the distinct relationship between the grocer and his or her occasionally customer, carrying implications for the length of time the customer remained in the shop. But also, it gave the customer the opportunity to inspect or smell and possibly even taste goods before they were packed. Opportunities that became eclipsed by pre-packaging. Such food packaging arrangements, where they were sort of this bespoke or on-the-spot packaging once somebody decided what amount of cheese or butter they wanted, persisted well into the 20th century. And in any case, as noted earlier, in Western Europe and North America until 1920s, most foods were sold unpackaged. It is then that one of the most significant part food packaging has played and continues to play in the modern food system. That's when it was initiated, as gradually foods were increasingly sold packaged, but really only after the Second World War. Now, if we look again at the image that I showed at the beginning, the relationship between the grocer and his customer, remember this is the UK in the 1930s. And remember the arrangement of things and people, the counter between the two of them, a pencil for the grocer to tot up the cost of goods being bought, the shopper with limited direct access to the goods, even those displayed on the counter, were not available simply for her to pick up as she decided to buy them. In the US, however, a decade and more earlier, patent was taken out. That's the drawing from the patent. And I suspect many people here will know what it is. And this is, of course, Clarence Saunders' patent. Now, by way of a quick recap, in the 1920s, shopping in several nations worldwide entailed some or all of the following. Shops were indoor, fixed spaces, artificially lit. A specifiable etiquette and well-understood relationship between shopkeeper and customer was routine enacted without, it is assumed, the need for either party having to think much about how to accomplish it. Prices were more or less fixed and advertised, ruling out both an implicit invitation to bargain as well as avoiding the need to ask. The idea of one shop not merely selling a multitude of items, but very different types of items, both packaged and unpackaged, had become familiar. This broad state of affairs was the background against which Clarence Saunders, a grocer, opened a new shop in Memphis, Tennessee. In the summer of 1916, he gutted the old store on a site he owned, and on the 6th of September in that year, reopened a new store of 1,125 square feet, using his Piggly Wiggly self-serving system. There it is. In October, he filed the patent for his invention, which was duly confirmed in the following year, 1917. The main immediately visible novelty of his creation was completely rearranging the layout, with most of the space thus cleared into lanes, lined with shelves on which groceries were ranged. In particular, he specified the almost maze-like routes customers were to take. You can see in this photograph. Clearly marked with arrows on the diagram, which I showed you earlier, that is included in the patent application. Thus, the customer was left to pay at just one place at the end of the prescribed path. In the process, the counter, probably direct descendant of the showing board of the 15th century, interposed between customer and shopkeeper, had completely disappeared. Disappearing with it was the part played by shopkeepers and their assistants as guardian of the goods over which they presided, authorities on their quality or desirability. Gone was the shopkeeper who knew the customers and what they preferred or could afford. Gone with it was that personal relationship that develops when people interact on a regular basis. Grocers and their shop assistants lost their authority and were, in inverted commas, reduced to the less skilled status of operators of tills and checkouts. And instead of goods being out of bounds, custom to the shopper, customers were invited and required to handle them, look more closely, able to pick up to compare different manufacturers' products and place them in a basket or that novelty, the shopping cart in the US or the UK is known as a shopping trolley. And what makes self-service possible is packaging. Certainly, customers can serve themselves from bins or tubs or canisters of loose goods, but it can be impracticable, slow, and whether by the standards of the 1920s or the 2020s may be regarded as unhygienic. While packaging by the grocer in the back room of the shop persisted until after the Second World War, in the UK at least, it overlapped with packaging by manufacturers, which was already established by the time Saunders patented his invention. Primary packaging was now undertaken by the manufacturer, and that replaced shopkeepers' packaging on the premises. Indeed, this shift made the major change in relationship between grocer and customer even more visible. No longer did the customer have to rely on the shopkeeper to fetch or lift down the items of interest. Shoppers' earlier reliance for advice on the grocer was supplanted by the information supplied directly from the manufacturers themselves on the package. Grocers and their authority was pushed out of the way as a new direct, if virtual, relationship between manufacturer and customer was placed. Now the customer could decide independently of the intermediary of the shopkeeper. Impersonal replaced personal service. So in sum, and I'm coming to the end and I have no idea how long I've taken, the whole relationship moved from a question of display and exhibition of the grocer providing the information, the grocer having control over access to the stock, and generally providing a personal and perhaps sometimes obsequious service to his better off customers. And that changed to the package displays and exhibits itself. It provides information directly to the customer, and the service has become impersonal. And this is my final observation. Excuse me. The source of information on the package then supplanted the grocer. The package displayed itself. There was no need for the grocer to show anyone anything. Prices were marked on the objects, or as what later became called shelf talkers, that little sort of plastic covered thing on the shelf of a supermarket, which tells you the price. The arrangement on the shelves made it easy for shoppers to survey what was on offer and to make comparisons without anybody else's help. There was no need for a shopper to feel pressured into buying by a shop assistant, with both of them conscious of a queue behind them getting longer. If a member of the shop is present now, they were either busy shelf stacking, presiding over the till, enclosed at the checkout, or trained to help inquiring customers, but only when they ask. And packaging has become, in the words of James Pidditch, who is a design specialist and consultant, packaging has become the silent salesman. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne, so much for your presentation. Has been really, really interesting. And probably you will have questions from the attendants today. So if anyone wants to ask a question, just so if I can answer your question about this food packaging, because it's kind of strange today. All this is packaging really up to the sky. So I wonder if the type of packaging was influenced by that form of arrangement?
Being plagued by a cough. Well, certainly there's discussion in the literature, and there may be those such as Zach Froelich, who I can see is here. It's good to see him. Know better than I. But there's quite a thread of discussions through the technical packaging literature about the shape of a container. And indeed, those, many people here may just have noticed for themselves that if you buy a can, say, of beans or sweet corn or something, there was a time when if you piled them up, they wobbled. But now they're designed so that the top of one fits neatly, they're coordinated. And so that makes a much more stable pile of things. But I think possibly more significant than display was actually transport, because I'm recollecting an interview I did with an industry insider who talked about preferring a square shape to a round shape, because it then meant that you didn't waste space on the truck or in the box, the secondary packaging, the cardboard box of, I don't know, sort of 20, 50 cans. So if you've got a spam shaped, and I'm thinking Kelly here, a spam shaped container, that doesn't have the bits that, it doesn't, you're not carrying an empty space, you're packing in as many as possible. It's more efficient. So I would have thought that the shape of a container was actually much more a question of logistics in transport and than actually for display, where display it would be useful, but it would be a side effect, and that it would be the manufacturers interested in their bottom line is making sure that they could transport goods in an optimum fashion, instead of, as I say, transporting air if you've got a cylinder rather than a square block. Sorry.
Thank you very much. Matt?
Hi, thank you, and thank you, Anne, for that great talk. It's always interesting to hear what you're saying on food packaging. I think you've kind of almost semi-answered the question I was going to ask, but I just want to sort of look at it from a different point of view and sort of wonder what if you had a sense of kind of where the power lay in this change actually occurring. So, who was it that was really kind of pushing for the salesman to become slightly less important and for people to sort of be more choosing of their food from the shelves? Was it the manufacturers trying to push for that because it made their life easier, as you were sort of saying, for the transport, for example? Was it the shops themselves because they were looking at ways to maybe cut costs? Or was it the customers actually saying, I want to be able to sort of look at the food myself without that kind of middleman? Did you get any kind of sense of where that kind of push was actually coming from?
That's a fantastically good question, because I didn't actually track that down sufficiently to be able to give you a clear answer. But I think, and I have yet to track down the response to Piggly Wiggly in the 1920s. But I have tracked down at least one, if not more, market research reports of the introduction of self-service in this country, in the UK, where it's a British Market Research Bureau from about 1950, I think. I'm sorry, I don't have a date with me. Where the report is introduced by saying, well, of course, there's this new way of selling that's coming. And that's self-service, and it's coming from the States, and we really ought to be ready for it. Now, I should just say as an aside, the reason why self-service was not nearly as widespread and picked up through the 1940s in the UK as it was in the States was because of wartime restrictions of one kind or another, which if anybody wants, I can go into, which meant that being able to change the layout of a shop so that it came from the counter and the old-fashioned grocer of the kind that I was showing you pictures before, with the counters and rather formal and rather ornate. And I'm sure many grocery shops are nothing like as luxurious. It would be the luxurious ones that were mostly photographed, I would guess. And that in this country it was badged, to use a sort of marketing expression, as coming from the States and the latest thing, and it was bound to be coming. And they undertook a survey of shoppers, both those who didn't yet have any experience of self-service and those who had. And although there was an initial wariness on the whole by shoppers, mostly they liked it. They worried particularly about overspending because it was so easy just to put stuff in your basket. But then they talked about how, you know, they eventually settled down and worked out what they needed and didn't overspend, and actually liked it. People liked it because it was quicker. They liked it because they didn't have to stop and talk and be polite to the grocer. They liked it because, you know, you could just get on and not be bothered. And as I say, it was quicker. So there was an approval as a response, perhaps, by the customers. And I would have thought that a main impetus was in retail, because it reduced the number of staff you had to employ, and or you could employ people at a lower wage rate if they were just, quote, on the checkout or shelf filling. The other thing too was sort of the demise of the small independent grocer as chains developed and bigger shops. You know, the one grocer who everybody came to was beginning to die out. Now, it died out later in the UK, again because of the war, because the system of rationing was organized whereby you had a ration book and you had so much, I think it was 2 ounces of bacon a week or something, and maybe 1 egg a fortnight. And the book had little coupons you could cut out, which then told everybody that you'd had your 1 egg for that 2-week period. But in order to claim your ration, you had to register with a particular grocer, a particular shop. So that tied people to the small independent grocers that were common in the 1930s. And that kept them going as small and independent. And it was only into the 50s that this retailers' push for developing supermarkets, as they're now called, came. So I think at the least there was both a willingness and acceptability by consumers, and also with an eye on costs and with an eye on increasing sales from the retailers as well. I can't comment because I know much less about the manufacturers, but I think your question, Matt, is a very important one, which I haven't got to the bottom of yet. Thank you for asking it.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you for that. And I've never really thought about the possibility of a kind of overspend worry at that point, sort of that actually the controlling hand of a salesperson was actually perceived to limit their buying rather than actually trying to push sales on it. So that's kind of an interesting point. So thank you.
Well, those shoppers in that market research survey sort of, you know, they adjusted themselves after a little while, after a couple of weeks of overspending, and then knew what they wanted and could ignore the temptation of these things suddenly available to take off.
Thank you very much. We have a lot of questions. So first in line is Anthony Bucchini, then Zach Froelich, and then Yuval Keshet. So Anthony?
Yeah, Buccini, yeah.
Bucchini.
Yeah, I enjoyed the talk very much, and it something you pointed out that it was very evocative for me, the pencil behind the ear of the shopkeeper, which got me thinking about where last I've encountered, despite even the presence of an electronic register of some sort, the continued use of the pencil on paper. In the States, the last places I've encountered that were now sadly all modernized or gone. German delicatessens and Italian salumeria, so Italian delicatessens. The last time I think I encountered the use of a pencil was in the 90s. And I lived in Belgium in the 80s and spent a lot of time there in the 90s, and that was still common in small shops. And that got me to thinking that the delicatessen sort of still operates more in this old-fashioned way. At least some do. Now they're gradually all being, fully modernized. And now, very sadly, there are deli counters in grocery stores, in supermarkets, which further remove the thing. But the experience of small scale shopping. But delis, some kinds of delis in ethnic communities, they maintain many of these sort of archaic features, including the relationship with the customer. And a lot of it has to do with scale. No, that as grocery stores have been turned into supermarkets. Of course, you're dealing with, at any given time in a supermarket here, 20, 30, 40, 100 or more customers. But delis, and to a degree maybe bakeries and pastry shops, kind of maintain some of these old features, and it's just sort of interesting anyway. So that's more an observation, but I was wondering, to what degree is that still the case in the UK? I don't have any sense of that you still have these small shops with those relationships between customer and business owner, et cetera, where the pencil comes out and they jot things down and so on.
They do exist. I'm afraid I don't know any data on the numbers and the proportion, but there's certainly, you can find them easily across London and other very big cities, and particularly, as you mentioned, in so-called ethnic communities, where many of those who arrive from other countries, at least I'm thinking about London or Glasgow, set up shop as one of the things which new migrants can readily do. They can set up their own small enterprise, small shop, and their family members are all, even the children, are helping to serve in the shop, whether they're legally or not, or whether they get paid or not is beside the point. It's a family shop. But sorry, I've suddenly caught that Matt's got a note which I'll have to look at in a minute. And not only was this a sort of an economic possibility for new migrants, they didn't have to go and try and compete for a job. They could, get the money together as a family to rent a small premises, but also they could provide a specialist service of importing groceries that were particularly used in the cuisine of whatever country the group of migrants came from. So in London, you can identify places where you would find Turkish food, say in North London, or where you could find shops that supply range of, and a much bigger range of Indian spices and so on. And yes, I'm fairly certain those kinds of, as you call it, archaic relationships persist, including perhaps a pencil. It might nowadays be a biro. But of course, they also coexist with, you just simply, put your credit card down and it's contactless. So in other words, what I found in general, and thinking about packaging very, very broadly, was that there may be innovations, but innovation upon innovation coexists with earlier forms. It's not a sort of, there's a change and there's a sort of direct mark. And, historians know that better than sociologists such as I. Thank you for your
Thank you very
question.
much. Thank you. Zach? I don't know if
It's Zach, yeah.
Zach, okay.
It's great seeing you, Anne, and really, we're kindred spirits in our interest in the subject. I made a comment that kind of emphasizes the close relation between grocer and customer. I know, at least in the United States, and I imagine in the United Kingdom, they extended credit to the customers, so it was very close. Like, they were very invested in the customer, regular customers, and so I just wanted to add that in. Also, not always in a positive sense. Like, there was also a kind of tension there. I had a comment related to kind of what Matt's question was going on, which was to say that you can see in the manufacturers in the United States a push towards packaging. So I think you do a really nice job of telling how changes in how grocers are retailing drive the appearance of packaging. But from the branded manufacturer's point of view, you have advertisements from them talking about substitution evil, where they complain about how grocers can kind of convince customers that one product is the same as the other. And so, like, they're really trying to figure out how to solve that. So there is this tension between manufacturers and the grocers in that sense. Adulteration laws, a lot of advertisements for branded manufactured foods focused on the idea that it was untouched by hands, because they were really emphasizing the fact that grocers were doing, like you say, they were putting stuff in the packaged foods. That meant they were handling it. Other shoppers are handling it. And so they're trying to emphasize, like, ours is untouched by human hand. And then the other thing that they were doing that really fits with your interest in packaging, or our shared interest in packaging, and I'm sure you know this, here you can see it, there's in a lot of sort of secondhand places, you can see all of this display counter sort of extension of packaging. And a lot of companies, like, we're close to Coca-Cola here in Atlanta. Coca-Cola would create this sort of counter display container that you could then stick their packaging in and say, hey, this will help you sell. And there was a lot of that kind of that precedes the packaging, and that made it sort of appealing for grocers to sell packaged goods. And similarly, crate labeling. When I was trying to figure out what was the origin of food packaging, one, you can see in patent medicines a lot of interest in packaging, sort of selling to the customer on idea of packaging. But in the logistics side, a lot of in the United States, a lot of long distance produce would be put in these big crates. And very early in the 1800s, you can see them to start decorating the crates. And the sort of famous story in the US is with the citrus producers in California selling Sunkist. They would put them in these crates, and it would evoke this kind of colorful Californian world. And so by the time it was there, sort of bulk sellers in their shops would be having the crates there, sort of selling the idea of California citrus. So crate labeling is a kind of precedes the sort of branded manufactured packaging. But you see a lot of the same focus on display and branding that you're talking about. So anyway, just to say, like, I love this project, as you know, and there's a lot that it sort of raises that I think is really exciting.
Thank you, Zach. Yes, you and I could talk packaging, and everybody else would be bored stiff, and we'd still be very happy. But the point you make about giving credit is very interesting, and I haven't followed it up properly. But I do remember from a very long time ago, 1930s, two young American anthropologists whose surnames are Arensberg and Kimball. And for the minute, I can't remember their first names. And they came to Ireland and they did a study in County Cork. And they particularly picked up on the relationship. And don't forget, Ireland was really very, very rural in 1930s. And that they picked up on the way that each village had its small shop. And it was these general stores, kind of a small shop where you got everything. You only went to the city, the nearest big market town, for very special occasions or very special goods. And that most of the villagers who really, the country was very, very poor at the time. Most of the villagers had a tab, an account. They bought things, what in this country is called on tip, and then they would settle the account. But what Arensberg and Kimball report is that you never, ever paid off all the amount you owed. Because if you did, that implied you wanted to sever the relationship between you as a customer and the shop from which you've been buying. And I can remember now reading this as an undergraduate, being so struck by the almost tangible way in which the relationship could be severed. So you always kept a little bit left, even if you suddenly had some money. You always owed just a little bit, so that both sides knew that the relationship hadn't been broken and that it was being sustained. And thank you for reminding me of that.
Thank you. I have more questions. And Kelly, you had a question. I don't know if you want to ask now.
Hi, sorry, I'm here. It was a question, and maybe you answered it in your talk. I didn't get to hear the end of it, but I was curious about, as you get this more distance between the customer and the grocer, do you see a change in like food labeling? So, for example, does labeling gain more information because the customer all of a sudden has to kind of do their own research, as it were? Or just curious about changes you see in that sort of thing.
We don't hear you, Anne. Wait.
You're muted, Anne.
Sorry. I didn't completely hear your question, Kelly. I'm so sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry. So
No, it's my fault.
I was curious about as you get more distance between the grocer and the customer, as sort of customers, do you see a change in food labeling? So I was thinking about, is there more information or just, if you see some change, I guess.
You shouldn't ask me, you should ask Zach. He's the one who knows about that. I think actually if he has something to say, you should think about is also legislative changes and regulatory changes, which you can't ignore, and therefore, so that, for instance, increasing requirements for you